Hello, everybody. My name is Dingo. I'm a hobbyist UK happy hardcore producer from the Bay Area, and today I'm going to be showcasing a small collection of utility patchers that I've created and used in my productions in the effects rack. So I'm going to be covering a gain patcher, a reverb patcher, a delay patcher, a Haas Effect patcher, as well as a sneak peek at my multiband and mid-side multiband sidechain patchers. So let's go ahead and go into reverb. So in my reverb patcher, the first fruity balance that goes in the chain is set to negative 12 dB. This is because the loudest element in my track when I gain stage stuff is negative 12 dB. And then the second fruity balance is often used to decrease that gain to whichever level I feel is comfortable for that specific sound. I use this to set levels, mainly for safety as well as for gain staging, though it is tedious to increase gain for distortions like Wave Shaper, where you might want to increase the input gain in order to get a very specific result. So in order to evade it, I tend to use TDR Kotelnikov right here. It's a compressor plugin. It does nothing on the default state, but you can use the outgain knob to increase the gain up to 20 dB. That is one way you could work around it. Another way you could work around it is to use a kilohertz gain snap-in plugin, which I believe is free, and you can increase the gain up by 30 dB and decrease it by 30 dB. Those are two ways to work around the lack of gain that fruity balance can give, which is only about 6 dB, in case you need to increase the signal. Now, moving on to the reverb. This is essentially a reverb send environment where the wet signal goes through here and the dry signal goes through here. And the dry signal is also routed to a fruity limiter because you can actually use it as a sidechaining signal to sidechain the wet signal to the dry signal. Now, some tips I have for reverb is that you can set pre-delay and decay times custom to the BPM. So, in the context of 170 BPM, dividing 60,000 by the BPM that you're working with will output the amount of time it takes in milliseconds to hit a quarter of a note or a beat. So with that in mind, 60,000 divided by 170 equates to roughly 353 milliseconds, which is the time it takes for a kick to hit in UK Happy Hardcore, or the duration of a beat in UK Happy Hardcore. So what you can do with this information is you can set the decay time to be 0.3 seconds, or 0.4 seconds, and that would make it align with a beat, though if you wanted to align it with a bar, it would be roughly 1.4 seconds, and then 2.8 for 2 bars, and then for 4 bars, it would be roughly 5.6. And this is calculated with just a little bit of math and maybe a little bit of calculation with a nice little calculator. Though this helps, another tip I would have is that I tend to gain stage the wet signal 6 dB below the dry signal. The reason for this is because let's say you have a signal playing out at negative 15 dB. If you have the wet signal playing at negative 18 dB, it actually tallies the overall signal up to negative 12 dB. Though if you had the wet signal to negative 21 dB, it only minimally increases the gain or the output volume to a little over 15. So you don't have to do as much gain matching, so the main dry signal doesn't actually lose any power. So it helps keep the dry signal at its intended position in the mix. Moving on to the delay, right here, it's a more simplified version of the reverb send, though if you wanted to set up the sidechain to dry limiter, but with the delay, you can just replace this, just delete it and replace it with the Fruity stock delay, Fruity Delay 3. Most of my tips will still stand from the reverb, but you can get more creative with the delay, adding things like distortion, gates, flangers, pitchers, resonators, the works, and you can get quite an interesting signal layering up the effects with the delay, with a wet delay signal. Now, moving on to the Haas Effect. So, the Haas Effect is an old school technique that people would use to pan their sounds in analog hardware, or in the older days, back when Ozone Imager and Polyverse Wider did not exist. So the main way that this would be accomplished is to delay either the left or right signal around 47 milliseconds. Depends on who you ask though. If you want to spice things up, you can do some quick math again to try to align it with your BPM roughly. So in the context of 170 BPM, what you can do is you can offset the left signal using this knob roughly to 11 milliseconds, which is 1/128th note long. And then you can multiply it by 2 to get 1/64th note, which is about 22 milliseconds. And then 1/32 note would be roughly 44 milliseconds using this knob. Though, if you wanted to do it to the right signal, you can just delete this delay and move it over here and use a knob to the other direction that would delay it over to the right using the hint bar over here. And that's how you use the Haas effect. However, now that plugins like Ozone Imager and Wider exist that are arguably more mono-compatible, it is a good idea to use the Haas effect on background elements like percussion and effects, as opposed to forefront elements like the leads or the pads, whatever might apply to your genre. And then from there, these multi-band sidechain patchers that I've made. One here is more conventional, where it splits a signal into highs and lows, where it splits it around 500 hertz, and then side chains them differently using different envelopes with the help of left filter. So for the lows, it'll do a tighter sidechain envelope where none of the signal passes through, but on the high end, above 500 hertz, it'll sidechain it such that 75% of the signal passes through. So it only provides a slight pumping effect. And then here in this mid side chain, it's pretty much the stock multiband, but split into mid and side signals. And this can create very interesting results for things like UK hardcore bass, where you get two different pumping effects for the mono, or quote unquote mono, the mid signal, and then the stereo signal at the sides gets a different pumping effect. It introduces a very distinct, very apparent sort of old school character, where there's two different pumping effects. So it introduces like a new sort of character when kick and bass are playing together. That is a very interesting result. Although I'll probably have to make a dedicated video on these patchers because these are still prototypes in the future. So that pretty much wraps it up for the patchers that I've made that use FL Studio stock plugins. If you like this video, be sure to share it with a fellow producer who could use these patchers to help boost their production. And if you didn't like this video, at the very least, I hope you learned something. Anyhow, I'll see you in the next tutorial.